Secretary General of the Organization of American States. It is a unique privilege and honor to have him here today. As the ranking member commented in a hearing we had in this very room about an hour ago, it is not a commonplace occurrence in which an ambassador of an international, multinational organization such as the OAS is before us. Secretary Almagro was elected the Secretary General of the OAS on the 18th of March, the year 2015. He is a career diplomat. He was the Foreign Minister of Uruguay from 2010 to 2015, and he has extensive regional and international experience. In 2014, Foreign Policy magazine named him a leading global thinker, one of 10 decision makers in the world who have been granted this international distinction. But the area in which we have seen him, I believe, exhibit extraordinary leadership is as a staunch voice on efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela, and we're fortunate to have him here with us today. I'm going to abbreviate my opening statement because I do want to get into the Secretary General's statement, and I know that the ranking member who's been working on this issue even before me being here in the Senate has comments that he needs and wants and should make as well. I want to be fundamentally clear. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the conflict that's occurring in Venezuela. A lot of people talk to me about the opposition, and while indeed they are in opposition to Maduro's regime, they are in fact the majority party in the National Assembly. In essence, they are the majority, not the opposition. The problem is that the people with the guns and the army who are in charge of Venezuela have canceled democracy. For those, I imagine, attending this hearing today, you do so because you have an interest in it. For those who may watch it now or in the future, you need to understand that what's happened there is the following. And I apply what's happened there to what it would be like if it happened here. Imagine if the United States had an executive branch that basically took over the Supreme Court and put political cronies on it, canceled all funding and all function of the Congress, both House and Senate, went further and actually ordered the Capitol Police to attack the United States Congress if we tried to conduct our functions, cut off all operations, no salaries, no paper, no ink, nothing, no lights in terms of being able to meet. In essence, completely wiped out an elected National Assembly under the Constitution of that country. Imagine further they announced we're not holding elections. We're not holding elections this year for governors and the legislative branch. We're not holding elections in the future for president. In fact, we're going to put together this fraudulent assembly, and we are going to impose a Cuban-style dictatorship under the guise of some sort of popular governance. That is the situation in Venezuela. Imagine even further, if, as an element of all this, elements within the government armed non-uniformed individuals and ordered them into the streets to attack protesters and beat them as part of militias. That is the situation in Venezuela. Or conduct trumped-up charges where they basically arrest political opponents, accuse them of ridiculous things, and jail them for extensive periods of time without charge and without recourse to the courts. That is the situation in Venezuela. And that is what brings us to this point. For what the people of Venezuela, the overwhelming majority of people in Venezuela, are asking for is simply a return to constitutional order. And I would say to you that it is not just the people that don't like the current leadership. It is people that actually agreed with Hugo Chavez. There are actually people that were supporters of Hugo Chavez and of the Constitution of Venezuela that have now aligned themselves with that cause, simply not because they ideologically agree with some members of the opposition, but because above all else, they want to see the rule of law restored. Chief among those voices is the current Attorney General of Venezuela, who on a steady pace over a period of time has begun to be critical of the Maduro regime. Today, she's now being charged with crimes for having done so. This is the horrifying situation. And if on the 30th of July, they move forward with this Constituent Assembly, which is a fraud, it will be, for the first time in my recollection, a nullification of the constitutional democratic order of a nation in this hemisphere in probably over 40 years. There have been coups d'etats, there have been strongmen that have emerged from time to time and disrupted the constitutional and democratic order, and there have most certainly been non-democratic leaders elected who then have not governed as Democrats. But we have never seen a structural imposition of a Cuban-style model in over 4 decades in the region. It would be tragic. It would be tragic anywhere. It is especially tragic that it is happening in Venezuela, a nation blessed with educated entrepreneurial people, with a deep culture of democracy, and by the way, one of the richest nations in the world. One of the richest nations in the world with natural resources and human resources that today its people cannot buy toilet paper, cannot buy toothpaste, and cannot access basic medications in their hospitals. All of it the direct result of the Maduro regime's decision. And finally, further complicating this matter is the existence within that government of narco-trafficking elements. Multiple leaders and figures in that regime who, in addition to operating governmental entities, are also involved in narco-trafficking activity to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. We have a catastrophe. And I conclude my remarks by saying that it is my hope that we can continue to work through organisms like the OAS in partnership with nations in the region such as Mexico and Canada, Brazil, Argentina, among others who have stood forward on this. I'm encouraged to see statements out of the European Union, out of Spain, and multiple other nations that have pronounced themselves on this. I'm hopeful of that. I think that is the ideal way forward. I also know this, and I do not speak for the President, but I have certainly spoken to the President, and I will only reiterate what he has already said, and I've been saying this now for a number of days. I have 100% confidence that if democracy is destroyed once and for all in Venezuela on the 30th in terms of the Maduro regime, the President of the United States is prepared to act unilaterally in a significant and swift way. And that is not a threat. That is the reporting of the truth. But in any event, we are hopeful that there is another way forward, but time is running out. And I certainly, within that context, continue to be hopeful that a real resolution can come about in the OAS, but not through some fake negotiation designed to extend and buy time, but through a process that restores the democratic order, restores the National Assembly, holds free, fair, and internationally supervised elections, and frees political prisoners. There's nothing really to negotiate there other than who's in charge of making that happen. Anything else is a waste of time and nothing but a diversionary tactic on behalf of the Maduro regime to try to hold on to power. So we are very excited that the Secretary General is here. We look forward to hearing from him, and I recognize the ranking member, Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this most important hearing today. And I especially want to thank our esteemed witness, the Secretary General, Luis Almagro. We are fully aware that it is not quite standard for the sitting Secretary General of an intergovernmental organization to testify before this committee. But your testimony and participation today speak to the gravity and importance of the crisis in Venezuela and in our hemisphere. I want to say that you have been an outspoken and vocal advocate for the values that bind democratic nations together and form the basis of regional and international cooperation that will ultimately bring peace and prosperity to our hemisphere. Given the stature of your position, I appreciate your leadership on Venezuela in particular, but beyond that, the important point of ensuring that the OAS stands for the principles of the rule of law, of democratic values, and shared responsibility, in essence, the democratic charter of the OAS. Now, between the referendum last Sunday, the proposed election on the 30th, and the ongoing humanitarian suffering of many Venezuelans, this hearing could not be more timely. The more than 7 million Venezuelans who braved intimidation and violence from their president to express themselves through a peaceful democratic process are a testament to the remnants of democracy that still thrive in Venezuela. They not only overwhelmingly express rejection of Maduro's efforts to further consolidate his own power, but also show the hemisphere and the world the power of organization and mobilization in the face of an autocratic president. Venezuelans who have for the past few years suffered a serious humanitarian crisis. Nearly 90% of the population reported last year that they did not have enough money to buy basic food supplies, and diseases that had previously been eradicated from the country, like malaria and diphtheria, have reemerged, are still marching in the streets and petitioning for their basic rights. Even as their president prevents international support for the basic humanitarian needs of its citizens, blocking an effort by the National Assembly to facilitate international assistance, they are voting to demand fundamental freedoms. Despite the suffering of his people and the international outcry, Maduro insists on clinging on to the shreds of a failed ideology his predecessor and a few colleagues in the region still champion. Without going into a full history of the calamitous actions he has taken in the name of the people or the revolution, some highlights include dissolving the National Assembly and then keeping the legislative, holding the legislative body in contempt, preventing the democratically elected assembly from passing laws, stacking the Supreme Court with loyalists to prevent an effective judicial branch or check on executive power, jailing opposition leaders and preventing them from running for office, expelling foreign media and curbing freedom of the press, violently attacking peaceful protesters, giving control of food supply to the military, who turned the responsibility of providing for the population into a profitable black market operation. This is happening in our own hemisphere, with significant consequences for regional peace and stability. In 2016, Venezuelans became the top United States asylum seekers, with claims increasing 150% from 2015 to 2016. Venezuelans are also fleeing to neighboring Colombia, itself in the process of implementing a precarious peace accord, and Brazil. Without vigilance and accountability, our adversaries will be quick to step in. So I was pleased to work with the chairman earlier this year to bring the Treasury Department's attention to Venezuela's state-owned oil company PDVSA's mortgage of debt to a Russian state-owned company, Rosneft. PDVSA in turn owns Citgo, which has significant infrastructure here in the United States. And this deal could potentially put critical energy infrastructure into the hands of Russia. China has also stepped in to help Venezuela's flailing economy. In 2014, I was pleased to have the Congress pass into law the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, which imposed sanctions on officials in the government most responsible for the erosion of democracy. And I'm pleased to see Congress extend those sanctions in 2017. I also urged the full committee to consider the Venezuela Humanitarian Assistance and Defense of Democratic Governance Act, which we introduced in May. This comprehensive legislation authorizes humanitarian support, expands the scope of sanctions, calls on the administration to develop a multilateral strategy, and express support for the OAS's democracy restoration and election monitoring efforts. The United States, of course, cannot act alone. Democratic countries in the Western Hemisphere must be united in our values to uphold the rule of law and to champion democratic values. In that vein, it is critical that the Organization of American States maintain pressure not just on Venezuela, but to try to ensure that member countries are working in a unified fashion. I know the Secretary General has that as part of his mission. I have been disappointed to see many countries in the region, particularly in the Caribbean, continue to stand with the assault on Venezuelan democracy or refrain from explicitly condemning undemocratic actions at the OAS. Along with Senator Rubio, I have expressed the importance of standing up with the people of Venezuela and unequivocally against usurpations of power and undemocratic actions to various foreign dignitaries. I know that I am banned from going to Venezuela by the Maduro regime, but I will continue to speak out for democracy and human rights in the Western Hemisphere, wherever it may be, and certainly in Venezuela. Mr. Secretary, we welcome you and we look forward to your insights.
Thank you, the ranking member. Secretary, thank you for being here today, and we recognize you for your statement.
Senator Rubio, Senator Menendez, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to be with you today as we address the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. The OAS, the Organization of American States, is the only multilateral forum that has taken action against the dictatorship in Venezuela. On April 3rd, 2017, the Permanent Council passed Resolution 1078 declaring an alteration of the constitutional order in Venezuela. The OAS declared the Supreme Court decision to suspend the powers of the National Assembly as inconsistent with democratic practices and constitute an alternation of the constitutional order in Venezuela. We urged the Venezuelan government to ensure the full restoration of the democratic order. We requested that the Venezuelan government safeguard the separation and independence of powers. We said that we stand ready to support measures to return to democratic order and to take diplomatic initiatives to foster the restoration of the democratic institutional system. in accordance with the OAS founding charter and the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The international community has a vital responsibility when faced with tyranny and repression. Venezuela is going through a decisive moment. In play is the sovereignty of the people and the survival of the Constitution, the last link of the country with the rule of law. In 100 days of citizen protests, nearly 100 people have been killed, the majority of them young people, many of them minors. The number of political prisoners has risen to 433, and 415 civilians have been brought before military courts. The systematic violating of human rights and basic freedoms is the worst attack against the Constitution. The regime proposes more abuse, more repression, increasingly less freedom, and the tool that it proposes to institutionalize this is a constituent assembly. A constituent assembly imposed by decree, without the people and against the people, setting the will of the dictatorship above the popular will expressed through universal and direct vote. I echo the words of the Venezuelan Episcopal Conference. The mentioned constituent project seeks to impose a dictatorial regime on the country. In addition, by privileging in its composition sectoral voting basis with no legal support, it violates the right to all people to elect and be elected and the constitutional principle of the proportional representation of the population according to territorial distribution. And it underlines that the National Constituent Assembly would have supraconstitutional power with the aim of eliminating the current state bodies, mainly the National Assembly, legitimately elected by the people. It is the right and the responsibility of all citizens to participate in decisions relating to their own development. This is also a necessary condition for the full and effective exercise of democracy. Promoting and fostering diverse forms of participation strengthens democracy. We are in a time in which mediation efforts are taking place. All of them, of course, welcome, because they demonstrate the commitment of the international community to the search for a solution to the crisis. In this context, the institution that is in the best condition to act is the Episcopal Conference, because it is Venezuelan, as we have said, because it knows people's feeling, because it knows better than anyone the history of this process, and because of its immense moral authority. From the international community, we have stripped the regime of its impunity. The alteration of the constitutional order has been recognized and denounced. The return of democracy to the country has been called for. Sanctions have been applied to corrupt and criminal affiliates to the regime. The freeing of political prisoners have been requested, and various mediation forms have been offered and will be offered. The work of the OAS has been and is essential in this sense, but the solution to the crisis is Venezuela. Over the last months, the regime in Venezuela has buried the democracy, the separation of power, justice, civil guarantees, political, economic, and social rights, as well as the principles that constitute a legitimate government. All the members of the current illegitimate government are responsible, and the role of the President of the National Electoral Council, Tibisay Lucena, has been crucial in the institutional collapse. An independent, impartial, healthy electoral body with adequate technical capabilities is fundamental to guarantee the political rights of citizens. Its responsibility is nothing less than the protection of the strict respect for the right to the political expression of the people, the only that is legitimate to carry on the country. The formula announced by Tibisay Lucena to the National Constituent Assembly is as technically absurd as it is unconstitutional and undemocratic. The convocation of the Constituent Assembly is taking place outside of that stipulated in Article 347 of the Constitution, which states that Venezuelan people are the only ones who possess the original constituent power. In this way, it definitely puts an end to the right of the Venezuelan people to democracy. People like Tibisay Lucena, that continue stripping democracy of its content, work to serve the consolidation of the interest of a dictatorship imposed through the suffering of its people, sustained by the killing of its people, by the political imprisonment of opposition leaders, and by torture. The Venezuelan judiciary also has violated the fundamental principles by which the people are ensured justice, its independence. It has become an essential part of the organizational chart of institutional corruption. If justice does not follow the principles and values of democracy and the rule of law, these accelerate the legitimate functioning of the states. The Bolivarian Guard, National Guard, and its head are directly responsible for the repression that has murdered, imprisoned, and tortured people. The brutal repression shows the National Guard as the perpetrator of the violation of rights to life, freedoms, and guarantees of due process. Behind every detainee, every political prisoner, behind every person tortured and killed, there is something institutionally responsible in Venezuela. The Minister of Internal Relations, Néstor Reverol, Benavides Torres, General Sabarce, led the two institutions charged with the use of force in Venezuela. In this sense, they are responsible for every aggression, every shot, and every death. The return of democracy to Venezuela and the restoration of the rule of law is urgent. Legitimacy will only be returned to its institution when those in power assume their functions according to the Constitution and the popular mandate. The Minister of Defense, General Vladimir Padrino López, has separated the armed forces from their fundamental commitments to respect the Constitution, the laws, and the institution itself. What we can do? We need to speak at the highest level, at the level of presidents, to make joint declarations at the highest level. Member states and leaders of the world must speak up all together and explore what tools they have at their disposal to act. I'm often asked about sanctions. And let me be clear, the sanctions won't do any worse to the suffering of the Venezuelan people. A clear message must be sent to Maduro and his colleagues that the criminals whose corruption, whose strategy, and whose orders have created this crisis and killed countless of their citizens should be targeted and held account. We support sanctions to individuals that have committed crimes and are accused of corruption. And we need more economic pressure on a government that is investing the money that it earns through the natural resources that belong to the people to fight and kill that very same people. Torture is a crime against humanity. We intend to support investigation, and we ask everybody to do so that may help to identify the practices of torture in Venezuela and those responsible for them, especially in front of the International Criminal Court. All our actions should be oriented to resolve this agenda. The agenda is free, transparent, just general elections, free the political prisoners, restore the power to the National Assembly, and an emergency plan to resolve the crisis, the humanitarian crisis of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'll be brief in my questions. They're rather to the point. From your understanding on the issue of revenue, to the extent that Venezuela continues to derive revenues from its oil industry, is it your understanding that money is being used simply to try to finance its debt at a discount, or in essence, they're selling that oil now at a steep discount? Is it not correct that the majority of the revenues they continue to generate are largely being used for corruption and or to finance the debt, and that very little of it is being used, and it is the reason why, for example, there's a humanitarian crisis in food, medicine, and other matters?
If we see all figures about health and nutrition in Venezuela, we see that practically the government is not investing at all in its people. All figures are awful and demonstrate a clear crisis in the humanitarian crisis in the country. The rates of child mortality, the rates of maternal mortality, the rates of malnutrition of children, diseases that were extinguished in Venezuela for decades, like malaria or diphtheria, have reappeared in the country. So we have definitely a government that is not investing at all in its people, but just to try to buy some wills, the will of through the clap bags given to in order to achieve some political support, and of course to keep working in their political agenda in the continent and abroad. Nothing is improving. The government of Venezuela is practically the antithesis of any government. Any government will try to bring the crisis down to problems back down to difficulties, and to make the difficulties disappear. What we see in Venezuela is the contrary. From nothing they create problems. From the problems they create crisis, and further they escalate this crisis. The situation of the people shows that the money of the national resources that belong to that people is used to kill these people. The only action of government that we see is repression these days.
The question of humanitarian aid and assistance, which the Maduro regime continues to block because they continue to refuse to acknowledge they have a humanitarian crisis. There was, however, a negotiation sponsored by the Vatican, mediated talks in November of 2016, and there was discussion about establishing a channel for allowing humanitarian aid to reach Venezuela, possibly through Caritas Venezuela, which is an organization affiliated with the Catholic Church. To date, that has not happened. For those who were not involved or did not see that process of negotiation when it comes to humanitarian aid, to this day, are they allowing humanitarian aid into the country?
They are not allowing humanitarian aid into the country. And the only measure that somehow released some pressure, some social pressure, was when they opened the border with Colombia in order to allow that people that live in border states to be able to buy their basic needs on the other side. But no international help is able to get into the country. There is definitely a need for action about that. And when you do that, these political measures, the expense of the suffering of people, is the most awful way of doing politics, and is the most coward way of doing politics.
As you're aware, the Treasury Department of the United States has imposed financial sanctions on at least 17 Venezuelans for narcotics trafficking, including 9 current or former Venezuelan officials. For example, in February, the Treasury Department imposed drug trafficking sanctions against the vice president of the country. There are also very strong allegations made by defectors and others about the involvement of an individual by the name of Diosdado Cabello, who in my personal view, based on everything I have seen, he's not simply a political leader. He is, in my view, the Pablo Escobar of Venezuela today. He is a narco-trafficker. How complicated in this political dynamic is the existence of this narco-trafficking presence in Venezuela to the political overall crisis?
When you see the structure of government, and you see the closest relatives of the presidential family are in jail in New York and are judged in New York for narco traffic, then you see that the vice president is the second in charge, has its resources for about $2 billion in the United States that have been sanctioned. When you see that number 3 is that Minister of Interior Rubio is also accused by the DEA by narco traffic, then you have really a serious problem, because it looks like the whole structure is taken by this by narco traffic. So it's not how you move out of, how you push a dictatorship out of and bring back democracy. It's also now how you dismantle narco-traffic from the state, and that is a completely new challenge for our organization and for our community. That is is a very serious problem, like corruption is a very serious problem. Venezuela is the most corrupt country in the continent. That in itself shows that nobody is judged by corruption in the country. The only way to judge them is international, like the cases that involved corruption of PDVSA in Houston. So to attack these issues definitely is an imperative in all our country. To apply sanctions that can help solutions in this field are extremely necessary.
And my final question, at least for this round, because Senator Kane has joined us as well, and I want to make sure multiple members have a chance to speak to you about this topic, is the following. It is our natural inclination as a nation and as a people and in the region, as is your job working in a multinational forum, to seek for there to be a negotiated process forward. In this perfect world, the Maduro regime would realize that this is unsustainable, and there would be some sort of conversation, a serious one, about holding elections for governor, holding elections for president, freeing political prisoners, and creating that space. However, and while I am not against that happening, I don't believe it is going to happen, and there's no indications that it's going to happen. And I would ask you to give us some insight into your views on negotiations, not in general, but as it pertains to Venezuela, and in particular, how the Maduro regime has used the ruse of dialogue and negotiation to buy time and divide the opposition and extend itself and perpetuate itself in power.
Yes, we have seen that, and we have denounced that. The way that the government uses dialogue is just to achieve two things, mainly: to release internal pressure and to release international pressure. That happened in the first week of November last year. There were not a single commitment to deal with the agenda that is necessary to resolve in Venezuela. In fact, if in Venezuela we don't call for free and general elections, if we don't free the political prisoners, if we don't establish the constitutional powers to the different branches of government, then no solution is possible. We can go around that agenda as much as we can, but there will not be a solution. The government so far has not been able to push for a solution like that. And it is very clear that the main task, and we saw it last year during the procedure of the recall referendum, we see it this year again, is how they remain in power, no matter what. Imagine that in any country in the continent could be demonstrations and 100 demonstrators were killed, anywhere. That government wouldn't be standing anymore. It's against the basic rules of democracy and human rights. The government, when they cannot use this tool of dialogue, they just go to repression. And then they try to move back to create some conditions of a dialogue without facing the real agenda of the country. I think these days when a real negotiation to put down a dictatorship happens, it is because the dictators come and say, look, how is the best way we get out? And that is how it starts. It doesn't start by bringing down the National Constituent Assembly. It doesn't start by trying to create side effects with the negotiations. you have to address the real agenda. So you put a date for the elections, okay, then we can have a dialogue. You free the political prisoners, okay, we can have a dialogue. You reestablish the power of the National Assembly, okay, we can have a dialogue. If nothing like that happens, then the conditions definitely are not there. It is awful that the people of Venezuela has been condemned to be killed in the streets or to be submitted to the peace that the dictatorship provides, that is complete lack of rights.
Well, as I turn it to the ranking member, my observation is when the Pope says he's no longer interested in continuing to participate in a dialogue because he doesn't think the Maduro government is serious about it, when the Pope says that, it's a pretty strong indication that of how they've used these negotiations as a farce. The ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. I don't often read from the written testimony of witnesses, but you synthesized your testimony in order for brevity. I think there are things here worthy of reading into the record. These are your words in your statement. The reluctance of the international community to act in defense of democracy has allowed the situation to deteriorate incrementally but consistently, to the point where today it has become a full-blown humanitarian and security crisis. Every step of the way, it has been too little and too late. The Democratic Charter was designed as a preventative tool. When it was agreed, it established a very explicit authority to act in every signatory state when necessity requires, which is often what I recite when I'm asked by reporters about the interventionist elements of our views. Venezuela signed on to the Democratic Charter, and the Democratic Charter calls, as you very explicitly note here, authority to act in every signatory state when necessity requires. When used as intended, it can prevent or stop any backsliding in the region's hard-earned democracies. It is true that only the people of Venezuela must solve the crisis in their country. However, in Venezuela, the words of civilians are met with the weapons of the regime. The people of Venezuela peacefully took to the streets in defense of their fundamental rights and freedoms. The regime responded strategically and systematically, targeting an unarmed civilian population with violence and terror. More than 100 people have been killed since the protests began. That is close to one person each day. Of those killed, more than 30, and there's a very young audience here, were under the age of 21. 24 were students. 14 were teenagers. Since the protests began, more than 450 investigations into human rights violations have been opened. Civil society estimates that the number of civilians injured is above 15,000. As of July 22nd, there are 444 political prisoners in Venezuela, the highest number since the military dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez. These statistics do not include the thousands of lives lost in the humanitarian crisis. The regime, I continue to quote from your testimony, has consistently rejected any and all offers of international humanitarian assistance. Instead, they have weaponized what little resources they do have, selecting who gets what. President Maduro, his cabinet, and his military leaders have blood on their hands, and they must be held accountable. End quote. That is not the views of some members of the United States Senate, or the statements of some members. It is the view of many of us, but it is the statements of the Secretary General of the OAS. And it is a powerful statement. It's so sad. Can you pull that up for me? It's so sad in a country that has enormous human capital and tremendous potential. So, Mr. Secretary, lo felicito por su postura vertical y su coraje y su compromiso a la democracia. I really appreciate, it's very often that in diplomacy we mitigate what is clearly the harsh in the light of day can't be mitigated, and I appreciate your straightforwardness. I want to ask you, and I don't describe this as a personal failure. It's institutionally I'm trying to understand. In June, the OAS failed to garner the 23 votes necessary in favor of a resolution on Venezuela, what was introduced by Peru. I go through some, and this is not an official sheet, so I may be wrong, and I will stand corrected, but I'm going to read from what was a photograph of a sheet of who voted how. So here are the people who abstained: Antigua and Barbuda, Ecuador, El Salvador, Grenada, Haiti, República Dominicana, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and then the people who voted outright no: Bolivia, Dominica, Nicaragua, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Why do you think that you could not achieve 23 votes in what is so clear? I mean, your statement is so clear, so unambiguous, so powerful. Why do you think that countries in the face of that would abstain and or outright vote no?
Because countries vote because of their interests and not because of principles and values always. And they have strong economic, political, social links with the government of Venezuela. And those links, they definitely value a lot, enough not to vote against Venezuela in those circumstances. In any case, I have to say that the importance of that resolution was to create a group of friends in order to deal with the Venezuelan case. Those days also, the last 2 weeks before that, happened that were something like 8 or 9 initiatives of group of friends, mediators and facilitators for the Venezuelan crisis. So that solution that could have helped Venezuela, I think, in fact, I don't think the government would have accepted that way of negotiating. In any case, we have to keep working on those votes, and we have to keep making evident what is going on in Venezuela. And the situation is clear enough, but also we have to say it around. We have to be loud about, and I think it also would be extremely useful, as I said before, that this group of friends, in any case, can start working, and can start working at the level of presidents, and can make joint declarations. In fact, the most important, the biggest countries, those biggest GDP, the biggest populations, they were there in that votation, concerned about the situation in Venezuela. So it could be just, it is possible to do it and to implement it and to create that group of friends at that level of president and to make it work and to have a loud voice about what is going on in Venezuela.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce for the record all of the names of the countries that did vote in favor, and for the interest of time, I have not mentioned them all because they should be applauded. But I do think it's important to name and shame those who who in essence voted to allow a continuing violation. That's the way I look at the vote. If you abstain or you vote no, in the midst of what is clearly a violation of the Democratic Charter, the OAS, for which you are a party and signatory to, then you are in essence permitting it. Do you think, last question before, I have many other questions, but I'll cease because of my colleague here is waiting. Do you believe that, I look at all of the Caribbean countries that, you know, so many of them voted either to abstain or no. Do you believe that, in fact, Petrocaribe and its influence have influence on some of the voting patterns here without specifying any specific country?
See, there is something that is, makes this case very particular, and is that we are dealing with a big country that has fallen into a dictatorship. that is something that the organization usually didn't do. Usually what the organization and in general international organizations choose are small countries with small populations that have a significant coup d'etat, and then the action comes. When we have seen this process of Venezuela, we see that these kind of problems are happen in the past. I mean, I can quote, for example, the case of the mission that observed the elections where Fujimori made a fraud, and that permanent council those days didn't approve the report of the mission and supported Fujimori. The countries that were sitting there supported Fujimori in that case. So it's not the first time that happens that it is difficult to collect the votes of countries that they just don't want to vote against their national interest or their political interest. So we have to keep working, and the principles are there, the values are there, and we may be able to keep convincing people and keep convincing countries. We have convinced a lot of public opinion. We have taken the impunity away from the government, and we keep pushing. If we see the process since the 31st of May, when I presented my first report, till now, when I presented my first report, I was practically alone, talking about political prisoners in Venezuela, talking about the need to go to to implement the recall referendum. That was the institutional solution of the country, and of course to stop stripping the powers of the National Assembly. If we see me myself alone there, and now we had 20 votes in Cancun, we have improved a lot, and I think if you ask me, and I support the decisions of the country that went through the process of consultation meeting of Minister of Foreign Affairs. But the rules of the meetings of Minister of Foreign Affairs is that decision have to be approved by 2/3 of the member states. If we would have gone through the application of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we should have just needed a simple majority, and that, I think, was the problem. More the procedure than the number of votes.
Thank you.
And the ranking member has entered into the record without objection a portion of your statement that he read. He also has entered the name of the 20 countries, and that, of course, will be entered into the record without objection. And I would just note, for the record, that those countries, those 20 countries, represent 1 billion people, and 90% of the population of the member states are represented in those 20 countries. With the senator from Virginia's indulgence, I just want to go ahead and put some things on the record. I don't want to forget. I'm going to ask the 3 reports that you presented to the Permanent Council, Secretary General of the OAS on the situation in Venezuela be entered into the record as part of the statement. The first 2 reports lay out the deterioration of the humanitarian situation, as well as the complete alteration of the constitutional and democratic order. They also represent a series of recommendations that offer guidance for the international community. The 3rd report was released this week. It details the strategic and systematic violent repression targeting the unarmed civilian population in Venezuela. And in addition, I also asked that the Permanent Council Resolution 1078, recognizing the alteration of the constitutional order, be entered into the record. And finally, this is interesting, a report from the Office of the Attorney General of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, meaning the Attorney General of, theoretically, the Maduro regime itself, released a report on July 10th detailing the 92 deaths of demonstrators at the hands of Venezuelan security forces during the first 100 days. And I ask, and without objection, it will be entered into the record. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General. This is a very important hearing, and I think we're all in agreement on the diagnosis, and we're looking for the prescription, ¿qué hacer? And one of the questions I want to ask to follow up on Senator Menendez's question is this. The vote in Cancun, You started in a lonely position, as you say, and then in Cancun, 20 votes. What would the effect have been in your estimation if the vote in Cancun had followed this referendum? 7.2 million Venezuelans turning out in the referendum and overwhelmingly rejecting the prospect of a dramatic rewrite by the Maduro government of the Constitution. Do you think there are abstains or no votes within that Cancun vote that, seeing this significant turnout and the significant will of these voters, might rethink their position? Or do you think if we had this Cancun vote, it would likely come out the same? I'm curious.
It's not so easy to speculate about voting in international organizations. It will depend on the circumstances. It will depend a lot on the words that we use for the resolutions that we are trying to instrument. The thing is, in any case, that I'm extremely positive about the 20 votes, and I am extremely positive about how loud the Minister of Foreign Affairs were during the General Assembly in Cancun. I think all those very positive actions that we have that happened in Cancun, and it was not at all a failure. I wouldn't describe it like that, not in the wildest dreams.
Let me ask it this way, if I could.
Yes.
What would you predict, then, setting aside voting in the OAS, what would you predict would be the follow-on consequence of this referendum vote, which was so strong? Do you think it will have any effect on the situation going forward, or is the government just going to say we don't care about it, and will it then, sink back in silencio?
The government didn't like it, and will never, but shows something very positive. Extraordinary capacity of organization and mobilization of the opposition and the National Assembly. We have to see the positive of what went on there. The government is not ready yet to respond in a positive way to that consultation that was done. Those questions that were asked, the way that people answer, are mandatory for all of us, and we should take it as mandatory for all of us. Are mandatory in fact for the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and he should be implementing these measures now. But that is not the logic of the government. The logic of the government is keep playing games, always find somebody that will keep playing games with them, and if playing the game doesn't work, like Senator Rubio said, then will come more repression on the country. And how long can hold that? They can hold that the repression, I don't know. But the scenarios that we see are very ugly for Venezuela, are awful for Venezuela.
Let me switch to another topic that's related. The Attorney General, Luis Ortega, had been a loyalist and ally of the Maduro regime, but in March of this year, as you described, she spoke out against an attempt by the Supreme Court to strip the National Assembly of powers, and she's since been critical of President Maduro for creating, quote, a climate of terror. The Supreme Court has banned her from leaving the country and frozen all of her assets. How significant is her decision to break with the regime, and would you see additional prospects, or think there would be additional prospects for key defectors from the regime, people who have been allies to defect and become opponents in the near future?
There have been. I mean, we have also have to see that a substantial part of the Chavismo had democratic rules, and most of them, a lot of them, they believe in democracy, and the permanent electoral exercise that Venezuela did during the years of Chavez, of course, came to an end, because mainly dictators, they like elections when they are going to win them. If not, they are not useful for them.
I've been on the side of a losing election recently. I like elections I'm going to win too. I mean, that's not just dictators.
Well, I won and lost one in the same year. Try that.
But that's a very good thing, and talks very well of you and of the system. And of course, more people have moved. Former Minister of Interior Miguel Rodriguez Torres has moved. You know that there are something like about 100 officers of the military, of the army that are in jail. So there are a lot of cracks in that institution, in that organization. So somehow we expect that more things, more people may come to the sides of democracy at the end of the day.
Excellent. Let me ask one other question. I was pleased to see the Trump administration state that they're looking at new sanctions against Venezuela, especially if they were to go through with the government's plan to try to do a dramatic rewrite of laws in the Constitution. Your testimony talked about sanctions as having a significant and salutary impact. It is imperative that sanctions do not worsen suffering of the Venezuelan people, but however, targeted sanctions that hold those criminals responsible for the crisis and repression to account have been helpful. The news reports that I've read in Bloomberg suggest that the administration is definitely looking at targeted sanctions against key individuals, but also there is some suggestion there is tension inside the White House about which measures to adopt and whether to wait to see how Venezuela's constitutional issue plays out. Among the measures creating division is whether to impose some sort of ban on crude oil imports from Venezuela. What opinion would you have of that, just to give us your thought and perspective about how that might help or hurt the situation?
You know, dictatorships, they only fall if they are pushed from within the country, from inside the country. They are not, unless you bomb them, and that is not a solution, definitely, there is no way to push a dictatorship down from abroad. So sanctions may work or not, and may not work. It depends on the internal pressure in the country. For example, there are sanctions that have worked. Those against the apartheid in South Africa, they worked, and at the end there were a democracy in South Africa. But the whole country was committed to have democracy and to have one man, one vote. There are cases where these sanctions have not worked because the internal pressure was not enough to bring the dictatorship down, like can be the Cuban case, for example. So, at the end of the day, the most dramatic measure that can be taken are sanctions. But those sanctions have to be in order to back the people, in order to regain democracy. But it depends on the people of the country, and it will depend on the Venezuelans and their struggle to be able to achieve this solution. I think sanctions should be supportive of the Venezuelan people. I think sanctions should further come and should have further economic pressure on the Maduro dictatorship.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman last night from Colombia. He grew up in Colombia, lives in the United States now, and he was talking about when they were children, if they wanted goods, if they wanted certain fresh products or produce, they would go to Venezuela and they would have access to the goods, the produce that they couldn't get in Colombia. And he talked about the excitement that they had in the family when they were looking for that to bring it home. And of course now what is happening in Venezuela is truly tragic, because that's certainly not the case today. I want to get a little bit into some of the global policies affecting Venezuela as well. According to a report from Brookings Institute on May 8th, 2017, the banks in China lent about $118 billion to Latin America between 2007 and 2014. During this time period, about 53% went to Venezuela. It's about $63 billion to Venezuela from Chinese banks. And so could you talk a little bit about the extent of Chinese involvement in Venezuela, whether it's helping to prop up the Maduro government, your perspective?
Thank you very much. I can talk a little. Of course, there are Chinese economic interest in Venezuela. Of course, I'm sure the China would like to have those interests completely safe, and that means that they will deal with the political situation in an objective manner. I think the interests there were mainly in projects of infrastructure. There were a lot of trade, and of course there are big interest in